Behind a casino floor in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, 5 blast furnaces as tall as a 20-story building stand floodlit in the dark, and the company that built them, Bethlehem Steel, is gone. The steel those furnaces poured raised the towers of the Golden Gate Bridge, the skeleton of the Empire State Building, and the frame of Rockefeller Center, and its 15 shipyards launched 1,121 warships, nearly 1/5 of the United States Navy's fleet. And yet the enemy that brought it down never crossed an ocean. It sat in the company's own boardroom. This is the story of a company that twice built the casting machine that could have saved it, then threw it away. Of a boardroom that ranked its executives by the dining room they were allowed to enter. Of 10,000 steelworkers dismissed on a single day, and of a pension debt so vast the federal government had to absorb it, the largest ever recorded. The furnaces that once built a nation now light a room built to help people forget it. The story of how it rose so high and what the fall cost begins in the winter of 1904. Chapter 1. The Defector from U.S. Steel. A century before those blast furnaces in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania would stand cold and floodlit behind a gaming floor, they belonged to a modest steelmaker that almost no one outside the trade had reason to name. Before that winter, the Bethlehem works turned out steel much as 100 other American mills did, and drew no more notice than any of them. It was competent and unremarkable, one more plant that a larger rival might have swallowed without pausing over the meal. What lifted it out of that obscurity was not a new furnace or a richer seam of ore. It was the arrival of a single man, and that man had just walked away from the largest company in the world. His name was Charles Schwab. He had run the United States Steel Corporation, the vast combination that the financier J.P. Morgan had assembled on Wall Street, the biggest company then operating anywhere on Earth. To sit at the head of that corporation was the summit of American industry, the exact place toward which every ambitious steel man of the age was climbing. Schwab climbed the other way. He left the summit, and in December 1904, he took hold of the small works at Bethlehem and reorganized it into the Bethlehem Steel Corporation. It was a strange direction for ambition to run. Men of that era measured themselves against United States Steel and dreamed of one day reaching it. Schwab had reached it, had held its highest office, and had then stepped down and away to rebuild something far smaller in its shadow. Nothing in the arrangement promised that the move would pay. He arrived at the Bethlehem plant with a reputation and a conviction, and little else that a ledger could yet measure. The rise of this steel empire, then, did not begin with a founder, or an inheritance, or a lucky strike of ore. It began with a defector, a man who staked the name he had earned at the top of the world's biggest company on the wager that a modest Pennsylvania mill could be made to eclipse it. He did not intend to hold that wager briefly. Schwab installed himself as the new corporation's first president, an office he would keep from 1905 to 1916, and he did not loosen his grip when the presidency passed to another. He remained the company's chairman until 1939, so that for the first third of the American century, the story of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and the story of one man ran as a single unbroken line. The blast furnaces answered to him. The town that thickened around their heat answered to the furnaces. What he took hold of that winter, he would preside over, in one office or another, for 35 years. What those furnaces had been built to pour was a thing the families of Bethlehem would answer in their own ways for generations. The version handed down across a kitchen table by someone who had once clocked in at the plant gate. Schwab had not abandoned the largest company in the world out of sentiment or out of any wish to rest. He had seen something in the overlooked Bethlehem works that the men he left behind had not troubled to see, and he meant to build a fortune upon it. It was not the ore which any mill in the country could buy by the trainload. It was not the furnaces themselves which any rival could bank taller and hotter. It was narrower than that and far harder to copy. But the fortune Schwab had defected to build would rest on none of those things. It would rest on a single shape of rolled steel that no other mill in America could yet make. Within a few years, the answer to what those furnaces were built to pour would begin to raise the skylines of the nation's cities. He had begun. Chapter 2. The beam no rival could make. The single shape of rolled steel that no other mill in America could pour was a structural beam, and it was the making of the fortune. Ordinary steel came off the rollers in familiar sections, the slender I-beam with its sloping inner faces that framing crews had bolted together for a generation. What the Bethlehem works learned to roll was heavier and broader, a single length of steel with wide, flat flanges standing parallel on either side of the web, and the men of the trade called it the wide-flange beam, the gray beam, or simply the Bethlehem beam. Its virtue lay in the shape of that steel cross-section. The broad parallel flanges put metal exactly where the load pressed hardest, so a single rolled beam carried far more weight for its own dead weight than the older shapes, riveted up from separate plates, could ever manage. A column of it could stand slender against the floors, stacked above and still bear them, and a girder of it could span a wide construction bay without sagging in the middle. The older way of raising a tall column had been to build it up, to take flat plates and angle irons and rivet them together into a heavy composite post, a slow assembly bristling with rivet heads and joints that added weight without adding much strength. The wide flange section swept that labor away. One pass through the right rolling mill turned a white-hot ingot into a finished column or girder in a single clean piece, its strength rolled into the metal rather than bolted on at the construction site. That was the shape a tall building needed. Before it, height was a fight against a structure's own mass, each added story demanding heavier and clumsier iron in the frame below. The wide flange beam turned that fight into arithmetic and made the steel skeleton, the internal frame that carries a tower from within while the outer walls merely hang upon it, a practical thing to build rather than a costly experiment. The gray beam was the shape that let a steel-framed building climb. The idea was not born on the Pennsylvania rolling floor. It belonged to an Englishman named Henry Gray, who had patented his method of rolling the wide flange section in 1897, years before any American mill would commit the machinery to it. The design demanded a rolling mill built expressly to produce it, and that was the wager the Bethlehem plant now placed. In January 1908, the first of the gray beams came off the Bethlehem rollers, the earliest commercially successful wide-flange shapes made anywhere in the United States. No competing American mill could answer them. For nearly 2 decades, the company stood as the sole United States producer of the wide-flange shape, alone in the market for the one beam the coming skyline could not be raised without. A builder who wanted the gray beam had one door to knock on, and it opened onto the Bethlehem yard. That was a rare position for any mill to hold in a crowded steel trade, where 100 plants poured the same ordinary sections and competed each other down to thin margins. Here there was no such crowd, and no such margin to defend, only a single stack of finished beams that every serious tall building project in the country would eventually have to buy. Not until 1927, when United States Steel at last brought out its own version under the name Carnegie Beam, did a rival finally match the section. By then, Bethlehem had held that monopoly for close to 20 years, the very span in which the modern American building learned how to climb. The first great proving ground for the beam was a store. When Gimbel's raised its new department store, the frame rose on 12,000 tons of Bethlehem beams, the gray shape stacking floor upon floor inside a building meant to move crowds through its aisles. 12,000 tons in a single commission was a quiet announcement of what the beam could carry, and the order books that came after would make even that steel frame look modest. A shape that had waited a decade for its mill was suddenly the material a whole industry of builders wanted first. The department store was only the opening. The same gray beam that framed a shopfront was about to be called for by the cities themselves, by the towers and the long bridges that a growing nation had begun to imagine and did not yet know how to hold up. Every skyline soon to rise across the country would rest, floor by floor and span by span, on the one section that only the Bethlehem rollers could turn out. The beam had no rival. What it needed now was a country ready to build. Chapter 3. The Nation That Could Not Stand Without It. The country that had been waiting to build arrived all at once, and every one of its ambitions came to rest on the same wide-flange beam. The department store in the last chapter had been a rehearsal. What followed was the performance. A generation of towers and long bridges rising out of the same Bethlehem rolling mill. The 1920s had set off a race upward in the great cities, each new tower straining to outreach the last, and every contender in that race needed the same section rolled in Pennsylvania before it could leave the ground. A river crossing in the Hudson Highlands, a skyscraper on a Manhattan block, a dam wall pressed into a western canyon, each of them, before it could stand, sent its order to a single steel yard in eastern Pennsylvania. The gray beam had waited a decade for its mill, and now the whole map of American ambition wanted it first. The roll of what that yard raised reads like an inventory of the nation's landmarks. The steel of one company stands in the George Washington Bridge over the Hudson and in the two great towers of the Golden Gate. It stands in the suspension tower of the Verrazzano Narrows, in the riveted skeleton of the Empire State Building, and in the limestone-clad frame of Rockefeller Center. It holds up the ballroom floors of the Waldorf Astoria and the arena roof of Madison Square Garden. It carries One Chase Manhattan Plaza on a single frame of 53,000 tons of steel, and it is sunk, thousands of tons at a time, into the spillway gates and powerhouse frames of the Hoover Dam, the Grand Coulee, and the Bonneville, the concrete giants that harnessed the rivers of the West. What the list conceals is how ordinary each of those commissions had come to feel by the time it was placed. Ordering the gray beam had stopped being a gamble and become a habit of the trade, the assumed first step of any architect who meant to build in steel. An engineer drawing a tower reached for the Bethlehem section the way a writer reaches for paper, without pausing to wonder whether it would be there. The catalogue of shapes the company rolled had become, in effect, the vocabulary in which the modern American building was designed. A structure was imagined in the gray beam before a single girder was ever cast. Set one after another, those names were more than a portfolio of finished jobs. They were a quiet confession of how far the country had come to lean on one set of furnaces. A skyline is a public thing, admired from a ferry deck or a passing car window, and almost none who admired it knew that its bones had a single maker. For the men who rolled it, the work was simply the work, ingots drawn white-hot from the furnace and squeezed into finished columns, shift after shift, with no thought that the whole silhouette of American cities was being settled on their rolling floor. The bridges the traffic crossed each morning, the office towers the clerks filled by the thousand, the dams that lit the far west after dark, all of them traced back through the delivery ledgers to the same blast furnaces standing on the Lehigh River. That was a remarkable place for any company to occupy, and a quietly perilous one for the nation that had come to depend on it. When a single mill rolls the beam that every serious tower must buy, a country's power to build tall and to span wide rests on that mill's furnaces staying lit and its rollers running true. Abundance of that kind was also a concentration of risk, for there is no hedging against the failure of the only supplier there is. The same near monopoly that made the company indispensable left the nation's skyline resting on the fortunes of a single firm, though no one reading the shipping slips in those booming years thought to call it a weakness. Dependence, when it is dressed in steel and standing 300 feet in the air, looks a great deal like strength. For the moment, the orders only multiplied, and the furnaces answered every one of them. The demand that had begun with a department store frame and climbed into office towers was about to be dwarfed by a demand of another kind entirely. Across the Atlantic, and soon across the Pacific, a second call was gathering, one that would ask this company not for beams to raise buildings, but for hulls to carry a war. The rolling mills that had learned to feed a growing skyline were about to be turned toward the sea. The same nation that had learned it could not build without the company was about to learn it could not fight without it either. Chapter 4. One ship every single day. The second call that had been gathering across the Atlantic and the Pacific finally broke, and the same furnaces that had rolled the beams of a skyline turned to pour the plate of a fleet. The drafting rooms that had drawn office towers began drawing warship hulls, and the rolling floors that had fed a growing skyline learned overnight to feed a navy at war. Where the company had once sold a single beam to an architect, it now sent whole vessels down the launching ways, one riveted keel after another sliding into the water beneath the gantry cranes. The shipyards that lined the coasts filled with welders and platers working under floodlights, and the war that the nation could not fight without steel found its steel waiting on the slipways. The numbers of that effort read less like a company ledger than a national census. Across 15 separate shipyards, the corporation's shipbuilding arm launched 1,121 ships, more vessels than any other builder in the country put into the water. Those hulls, counted together, came to nearly 1/5 of the entire United States Navy's two-ocean fleet, the destroyers and transports and cargo carriers that fought a war on two oceans at the same time. At the height of the work, shipbuilding alone drew as many as 180,000 men and women through the yard gates, out of a total force of roughly 300,000 across the whole enterprise. A fifth of a navy and a small city's worth of workers, all of it flowing out of one firm's dry docks and launching platforms. At the center of that machine stood a single figure whose name the public rarely learned, though he ran one of the largest industrial efforts in the nation. President Eugene G. Grace had climbed the company from the floor to its highest office, and by the war years he governed the whole enterprise from a desk in eastern Pennsylvania. In 1943, with the fleet still being built faster than the enemy could send it to the bottom, Grace made a promise to President Franklin Roosevelt that gathered the entire ambition of the effort into a single line. He pledged that his yards would manufacture one ship per day. It was the kind of vow that in another mouth would have been mere wartime bravado, a line for a recruiting poster rather than a schedule a yard foreman could keep. And yet the launching ways did more than reach that figure. They passed it. Over the span of that pledge, the corporation's shipyards delivered 15 ships beyond one for every day of the calendar, sending finished hulls into the harbor at a tempo no American shipbuilder had ever sustained. The promise that sounded like propaganda turned out to be a floor the welders and riveters cleared with room to spare. There is a cold AW in the arithmetic of that, in the image of a hull taking shape on the ways each morning, plated and welded and slid into the tidewater before the next dawn brought its replacement onto the empty blocks. The riveting guns ran in shifts around the clock, the cranes swung plate through the night, and the launching platforms were scarcely cleared of one vessel before the keel of the next was laid across them. The same corporation that had quietly raised the American skyline now, just as quietly, outbuilt every rival shipbuilder in the country, its gray hulls sliding into the water from Atlantic Yard and Pacific Yard alike. For the second time in a single generation, the nation discovered that it could not do the essential thing, this time win a war, without the steel pouring from one company's blast furnaces. This was the summit of everything the firm had built toward. Never again would it stand so plainly at the center of American power, the indispensable maker of the country's towers and the country's fleet in the same decade, its furnaces lighting the night sky over the Lehigh River as they never had before and never would again. The men who ran the rolling mills and the launching ways had reason to believe, in those floodlit war years, that the company had become permanent, a fixed feature of the Republic, like the landmarks its beams held up. But a firm that learns it can command a nation in its hour of need tends to learn something else alongside it, a quieter lesson about what the men at the very top of it are worth. In the offices above the crowded yard gates, the same war that filled the slipways with workers had begun to fill a handful of executive accounts on a scale that would not stay hidden. The rewards flowing to the men who signed the shipbuilding contracts were climbing toward figures that the company's own shareholders would one day walk into a courtroom to try to stop. The furnaces were never brighter than in those war years, and the launching ways never busier. What the corporation was forging on the floors above the shipyards, alongside the hulls and the plate, was a habit of reward at the top that it would never afterward learn how to switch off. Chapter 5. The bonuses the shareholders sued to stop. The rewards that had begun to gather in the executive offices above the crowded shipyards did not stay a private matter for long, and within a few years the company's own owners would carry them into a courtroom. The habit of reward at the top, formed in the years when the blast furnaces along the Lehigh River burned brightest, had a figure attached to it, and the figure belonged to the man who ran the corporation. In 1929, the single annual bonus paid to Grace, the president, exceeded $1.6 million. Measured against the printed pages of the company's own annual report, that one payment came to about 3.3% of everything the entire enterprise had earned that year, a sum lifted from a single line in the ledger and delivered to a single desk. It was enough, in a decade when a man at the rolling mill counted his wages in the low thousands, to place Grace at the very top of the national salary tables as the highest-paid executive in the United States. The company that had raised the country's towers and, a little later, would build a fifth of its wartime fleet, had also, quietly, in the same offices, perfected the art of writing very large checks to the men who signed the contracts. The incentive program that produced that figure was not a single indulgence, but a standing machine, written into the company's own arrangements and running year after year through the boardroom, distributing to the executive suite a share of the profits the mills below had poured. Its scale was such that in 1931, with the country sliding into the Depression and the dividends thinning on the shareholders' stock certificates, a group of the corporation's own owners walked into court. They named Schwab, the chairman whose signature had built the firm a quarter-century before, along with 12 of the company's officers, and they filed suit asking that the executives return $36 million in bonuses paid out since 1911. It was a striking arrangement to see set down in a legal filing. The people who held the shares suing the people who held the offices, trying to reach back 2 decades and pull the money out of the accounts it had settled into. The suit itself is a marker of something the glossy annual reports never printed in plain type. For the owners of a company to sue its own leadership over pay was more than the ordinary friction of a boardroom. It was the sound of a machine that had grown so comfortable rewarding itself that the men who actually owned it felt they had to go to a judge to slow it down. The furnaces on the riverbank were still lighting the night sky. The order books were still thick, and in the paneled rooms above them the argument had already begun over how much of that fortune the men at the top were entitled to keep. What the courtroom could not fix, time did not cure. The pay culture outlived the man who had built it. Long after grace had passed from the president's chair, the same corporation kept surfacing at the very top of the country's tables of executive compensation, its name printed again and again where the largest salaries were listed. In 1958, the chairman of the company, Arthur B. Homer, stood as the single highest-paid corporate officer in all of America, drawing $511,249 from the firm in that 1 year. The season before, in 1957, the same office had paid him $623,336, a figure recorded on the compensation rolls beside his name. 2 eras stood decades apart, one before a world war and one well after it, and yet the same masthead kept appearing at the head of the pay list. Whatever else the corporation may or may not have been perfecting in its rolling mills through those middle years, the one thing it never lost the knack for was the size of the reward it wrote for its own leadership. The steel poured, the tonnage rose and fell, competitors came and went, and the checks at the top of the company held their place near the summit of the national ledger. Money arriving on that scale does not merely rest in an account and wait, it builds a world around the men who receive it. Around the executive offices at the head of the company, a way of living had begun to take shape, sealed off from the mill floor and the yard gates, an enclosed world of privilege that the pay had purchased and the leadership had learned to inhabit. It had its own rooms and its own rituals, arranged among the men at the top and settled entirely on their own terms, and it was inside that closed and comfortable world that the fate of the whole enterprise would soon be decided. Chapter 6. Ranked by the room they ate in. The enclosed world that the pay had purchased had a floor plan, and the first thing it arranged was the midday meal. Inside the executive offices above the Lehigh River, the company had built a set of private dining rooms, and a man's place at their tables was fixed not by appetite, but by his rank on the corporate ladder. It was a hierarchy rendered in table linen and paneled walls, a caste system, as the journalist John Strohmeyer would later set it down in those exact words, in which each tier of the leadership took its lunch in the room assigned to its station. The senior men ate behind one set of mahogany doors, the men a rung below ate behind another, and the boundary between the two was as real as any wall on the mill floor. To rise inside the corporation, then, was not only to earn a larger check, but to be admitted to a better room, to move up through a graded series of tables that mirrored, plate by plate, the order of command. A younger executive learned the map of the dining rooms as quickly as he learned the map of the works, because the two were the same map. Where a man ate announced what he was, and the white tablecloths kept the accounting as faithfully as the ledgers in the offices below. A promotion could be measured in the distance between one table and the next, and the whole apparatus taught its people, meal after quiet meal, that the shape of their world was a ladder, and the point of a career was to climb it. The same order followed the executives out of doors and onto the grass. When the workday closed, the leadership gathered not in the town below, but at the Saucon Valley Country Club, a golf course the corporation itself subsidized, laid out for the comfort of the men who ran the company. There, on the fairways and the clipped greens, the same faces that had eaten by rank at noon played their rounds together in the afternoon, sealed inside the same circle, drawing the boundary of their world a little wider around the clubhouse and the 10th hole. The lunch table and the putting green were two halves of one enclosure, and a man moved between them without ever passing through the gates of the ordinary city outside. It was a comfortable arrangement, and its comfort was precisely the danger. For the country club and the graded dining rooms were not idle luxuries set apart from the business. They were where the business was decided. Strohmeyer, who watched the corporation from close range, recorded that the board's word inside that circle settled everything, great matters and small alike, from building new open hearths to installing a new sand trap on the 10th hole. The same table that ruled on a furnace ruled on a bunker, and it ruled on both with the same unhurried confidence. The line reads first as a joke about privilege, a picture of men who golfed on the company's money. It is also the whole warning of the story folded into a single sentence. A leadership that weighed a new open hearth and a new sand trap at the same meeting, in the same paneled room, among the same untroubled faces, had begun to lose the reflex that tells an enterprise which of its decisions can end it. The furnace and the bunker had come to feel like matters of the same order, and a boardroom that cannot tell them apart is a boardroom that has stopped watching the horizon. This was the insularity that the money had built, and it did its damage quietly, by what it kept out. Around the private dining rooms and the manicured fairways, the corporation had drawn a boundary so smooth that little news from the wider world of steel had any easy way across it. The men inside the circle answered to one another and dined with one another and golfed with one another, and the arrangement returned to each of them, every day, the same reassuring reflection in the clubhouse glass. It was a world superbly built for agreeing with itself, and all but deaf to any suggestion that it might be wrong. And a warning was, by then, beginning to gather beyond the clubhouse gates. In the mills of Europe and Japan, and soon in small upstart plants much nearer home, a new way of turning molten steel into finished shape was being tried, a method that promised to skip whole costly steps the company had performed for half a century. The decision on whether to reach for that machine or to wave it away from the comfort of the 10th hole would fall to exactly these men at exactly these tables. It was a decision the enclosed world was about to make twice, and to get wrong both times. Chapter 7. The Machine. They threw away twice. The decision that the closed circle had been drifting toward for years finally arrived on the mill floor in the form of a machine, and the corporation would meet that machine twice and turn it away both times. For half a century, the making of steel had ended in a ritual the company knew by heart. Molten steel was poured from the roaring furnace into a long row of upright cast-iron molds, where it cooled slowly into heavy blocks called ingots, rough and gray and solid. Each ingot was then reheated in a soaking pit until it glowed orange again, hauled to a rolling mill, and squeezed between heavy rollers into the slabs and blooms from which every finished shape was later drawn. It was a sequence of separate and costly stages, every one of them burning its own fuel and time and labor, and the corporation had built its entire works around performing it, furnace and pit and mill strung in a long chain across the valley floor. Continuous casting erased most of that chain in a single stroke. Instead of pouring the molten steel into ingot molds and letting it cool into blocks, The new method fed it straight from the ladle into a water-cooled copper mold open at the bottom, where the steel emerged as one unbroken strand, drawn steadily downward as it hardened and sheared to length as it ran. The ingot stage vanished. The reheating in the soaking pits vanished. The primary rolling that had turned cold ingots back into hot slabs vanished along with them. What had been a line of separate furnaces and pits and mills collapsed into a single continuous machine, and the steel that came off its end cost markedly less to make, because so much of the old labor had simply been engineered out of existence. In the mills of Europe and Japan, this was the exact machine that would soon let foreign steelmakers set finished product on American docks for less than the Lehigh works could manage, and undersell the very company whose beams had raised the skyline. Bethlehem met continuous casting first as a working pilot, a small operating caster running inside one of its own plants, proof in living metal that the method did everything its designers had promised. The corporation studied that machine, weighed it from the paneled offices above the river, and set it aside. The reason entered in the record was that the pilot was, in the company's own words, not a high-production unit, too modest in output to interest a giant that counted itself in millions of tons a year. A smaller and hungrier rival mill would have seen the beginning of something. The men who ran the works saw only a curiosity beneath their scale, and they let the future idle in a corner of the plant until the day they quietly shut it off. If this account of a great company quietly disarming itself is holding you, take one moment to subscribe. I am Empire of Acres, and I follow the American fortunes that built the country down to the exact ground they end on, one story at a time. The people who lived inside these mills are the ones I most want to hear from. If your father or your grandfather ever worked a shift on the Lehigh or in the Johnstown plants this chapter is about to enter, stay with me to the end and tell me in the comments what they brought home about the way the place was run. The second refusal cost far more, and it was much harder to explain away. At its Johnstown works in Pennsylvania, the corporation had started to build a full-scale caster of its own, a 4-strand machine designed to pour 4 continuous ribbons of steel at once, the very kind of high-production unit whose absence had been the excuse the first time. The company carried the project almost the whole distance to the finish. By the time the fatal decision came, the 4-strand caster stood roughly 90% complete, a nearly finished structure of pipe and mold and heavy framing waiting only on its final 10th. And the corporation scrapped the half-built machine. The abandoned caster was left where it stood on the Johnstown floor, and with it went the roughly $10 million already poured into its construction, written off as though the money had never been steel at all. Twice then, the same enclosed leadership had been handed the precise machine the foreign mills were already sharpening against it, and twice it had turned that machine away, once as too small to notice, and once as a $10 million frame not worth its final 10th. Nothing about either refusal had been forced on the company from outside. Both had been chosen, freely and at leisure, inside the executive offices above the Lehigh River, at the same untroubled remove from which every lesser matter had long been settled. And the harm of a choice made that way does not stay where it is made. And yet, in the very years the company was turning the machine away, the blast furnaces along the river were running harder than they had ever run, driving toward a single year's tonnage that would arrive looking like the summit of everything the works had ever built. The record was already on its way up the valley, and it would hide the rot beneath it for as long as any record could. Chapter 8. The Record That Hid the Rot. The record the last chapter watched climbing the valley finally crested in 1964, And for one shining year, the blast furnaces along the Lehigh River looked exactly like a company at its summit, rather than a company already coming apart beneath its own smoke. In that single year, the corporation poured a record 19,436,000 tons of raw steel, the greatest tonnage the Bethlehem hearths had ever produced or ever would. It was the high water mark of the entire enterprise, more finished metal off one company's furnaces in 12 months than in any 12 months before it or after. And it arrived, as high water marks tend to, at the exact moment the tide had already turned. The men reading the production sheets in the paneled offices above the river saw the largest number in the company's history and read it as proof that largeness itself was the natural order of things. The record did not read to them as a peak with a downslope waiting on its far side. It read as a floor, a confirmation, a permanent condition of being the biggest, and so the tonnage that should have been studied as a warning was instead filed away as a trophy. The complacency had a creed, and its founding article belonged to Grace himself. The United States will never catch up to its material needs and aspirations. It was less a forecast than an article of faith handed down from the top of a company that had raised the century's skyline and could not picture a century that would go on raising skylines without it. From that same altitude, the men who ran the mills looked down at a new kind of competitor, the small electric mini-mill melting scrap steel in modest annual runs, and waved it off the balcony sheet. If a guy comes on stream with 60,000 tons a year, let's not worry about that. Set the two figures side by side on the same page, and the arithmetic of the contempt becomes visible in the ledger. A corporation that had just poured 19,436,000 tons in a single year could hardly be troubled by a rival mill making 60,000, a figure that landed as a rounding error against the Bethlehem total, roughly 0.3% of 1 year's output off the Lehigh furnaces. 60,000 tons was no competitor to a company that counted itself in the 19 millions, only a decimal, a smudge at the bottom of the sheet, a number small enough to laugh at from behind the assigned doors. But the mini-mills did not stay at 60,000 tons. They multiplied across the map while the giant stood still at its record, each new furnace small and cheap and quick, each one carrying the low costs the enclosed leadership had already refused to build into its own plants. The rounding error compounded, mill by mill and year by year, into the flood that would one day run the record clean under. For the tonnage of 1964 was never beaten. It stands in the company's history as a ceiling rather than a base, the last and highest entry in a production ledger that from that year forward only counted downward. The furnaces kept roaring through the middle 60s, and the number kept slipping, quietly, a little further under the trophy each season, while the same closed rooms settled the same matters at the same untroubled remove and mistook momentum for health. A company still shipping and still hiring can look, from those offices, exactly like a company still winning. The gap between those two things is the space a decline lives in before anyone names it, and a hidden rot under a record is still a rot. It does not stay buried on the company's schedule, and it does not announce itself in a production figure or a boardroom creed. It becomes visible on a particular morning at a particular gate, when years of quiet refusal finally arrive as something a worker can see from the plant parking lot. That morning was already on its way up the valley toward the Lehigh works and toward the plants scattered beyond it, and when it came, it would carry no tonnage number and no article of faith. It would carry men walking out through the mill gates with everything they owned held in their two hands, and the record of 1964 would be no protection to a single one of them. The summit had its date, and the reckoning was about to be given one of its own. Chapter 9. 10,000 Gone in a Day. The morning came on the 30th of September, 1977, and the men who walked up to the mill gates carrying their lunch pails found the reckoning waiting for them in the form of a single printed notice. It would be remembered in Lackawanna and in Johnstown as Black Friday, and the name fastened itself to those towns the way rust fastens to a length of idle rail. By most accounts, the corporation let go roughly 10,000 workers in that one stroke, hollowing out the sprawling Lackawanna plant on the New York shore of Lake Erie and the older works at Johnstown in the Pennsylvania hills. No warning shift had prepared them. No gradual thinning of the payroll had softened the number, and the parking lots outside the plant gates emptied that autumn of the cars that had filled them for a generation. For the towns themselves, the loss was not counted in tonnage or in dollars. It was counted in the plant whistle that had marked the beginning and the end of every shift for longer than most families in the valley could remember. The same whistle that had told a child in a hillside kitchen exactly when a father would come walking up the road from the furnace yard. It was counted in the payday envelope, in the corner tavern that opened its doors the moment the day shift let out, in the single working road that ran from the row houses down to the mill and carried nearly everyone in town to the same gate. A steel town was an arrangement of ordinary lives built entirely around the rhythm of the plant, and when the plant stopped needing them, that rhythm did not slow. It broke. 10,000 was a number that did not behave like a layoff. A layoff was 100 men set loose in a slow season, a line that shortened at the time clock and then filled back in when the orders returned. 10,000 in a single day was a thing the region had no machinery to absorb, a shock that ran outward from the furnace gates into the hardware stores and the parish halls and the grade school rolls, into every business along the valley that had quietly depended on a steel worker's wage without ever pouring a pound of steel. When the corporation released that many men at Lackawanna and Johnstown at once, it did more than shed employees. It pulled the floor out from under two towns in an afternoon. The explanation that traveled out with the layoff notices was foreign steel. Cheaper tonnage was arriving from mills across the ocean, landing at American ports at a price the Bethlehem furnaces could no longer match, and by that autumn the imported coil and plate had taken a share of the market the company had once held outright. It was true as far as it went. But the foreign steel had found its opening in a plant the boardroom itself had left undefended, in the same paneled offices along the river that had twice built and twice scrapped the one machine that might have met the imports at their own price. The tide that came in from abroad ran through a breach the leadership had cut in its own wall. And so the story arrives at the fork it has been sharpening toward from its first minute. Was Bethlehem Steel killed by the cheaper steel shipped in from across an ocean, or by the boardroom that would not spend on the one machine that could have met it? Lay the two explanations side by side and tell me which one you weigh heavier. The men walking out through the gates that morning did not have the luxury of the question. They carried mortgages written against 30 years of steady work at the furnaces, sons who had expected to follow them onto the same mill floor, and a skill the closing had just rendered worthless in the only town that had ever paid for it. The corporation that had once promised the country a finished warship every day now measured its future in the men it could cut before the next quarter, and the cold arithmetic that had laughed the small competitors off the balance sheet a decade earlier now ran in the opposite direction, subtracting names from the valley one plant gate at a time. Black Friday was the first day the rot became a thing a worker could see from the plant parking lot. The gates at Lackawanna and Johnstown would keep opening outward in the years to come, and the great furnaces along the Lehigh River, still lit and still roaring over the black water that night, had already begun a long cooling that no coming shift would ever reverse. The number 10,000 was a beginning, wearing the shape of an ending. What came to the gates that September morning was not the end of Bethlehem Steel, only the first morning its towns could watch that end coming up the valley toward them. Chapter 10. The Furnaces Go Cold. The end that the towns had watched gathering up the valley did not fall in a single stroke the way the layoffs had. It came instead the way a blast furnace itself goes cold, slowly and from the inside, the great stack holding its stored heat long after the last charge has stopped feeding it, the brick going gray while the outer shell still looks alive. What Black Friday had made visible from a plant parking lot took the better part of another quarter-century to finish, and the finishing was measured not in whistles or in shifts, but in the figures that crossed the corporation's balance sheet, each one larger and colder than the one before it. The men in the executive offices along the Lehigh River were no longer managing a company so much as reading the temperature of a body as it fell. The dying first showed as a single catastrophic number on a ledger page. In 1982, as a hard recession closed over American industry and the imported coal kept arriving at the docks by the shipload, Bethlehem Steel reported a loss of $1.5 billion in a single year. It was a hemorrhage on a scale the company had never once known across its long ledger of record profit, a river of red ink running down a single accounting page and carrying off in 12 months what a generation of furnaces along the river had earned in good times. The balance sheet that had once measured the strength of a national industry had become the chart of a decline. Then the fires themselves went out. In 1995, after roughly 140 years of pouring molten steel on the south bank of the Lehigh, the original Bethlehem plant stopped making steel for good. The great blast furnaces that stood in a gray row above the water were banked and let go cold, the last heat drawn down out of them, the tap holes sealed. For the first time in the memory of anyone then living in the town, the stacks that had washed the Pennsylvania night sky a low furnace orange for the better part of a century stood black and silent over the river. The mill that had raised a skyline and armed a navy fell quiet, and the quiet was the loudest thing the valley had heard. The corporation staggered on for 6 more years on the strength of its outlying plants and the long momentum of a great name, and then the name itself gave way. In October of 2001, Bethlehem Steel filed for bankruptcy protection under Chapter 11, carrying roughly $4.5 billion of debt into the federal courthouse. It went down not alone, but in a crowd, the 25th American steelmaker, to fail in the 4 short years, from 1998 to 2001, one more darkened plant in a national row of darkened plants that had stretched from the mills of the Monongahela to the shore of Lake Erie. Set the ruin down in a single row, and the drum roll of it plays without commentary. $1.5 billion lost in 1 year. 140 years of unbroken steelmaking ended by a single decision on a single afternoon. $4.5 billion of debt carried up the courthouse steps. And one company standing 25th in a line of 25 American mills that had failed in barely 48 months, each collapse an entry in a national ledger of the same closing story. The figures had been getting colder for 2 decades, and now they had reached the temperature of a dead furnace. Numbers were the only language precise enough to record the death, and the least able to hold what had actually died. $1 billion loss could be written on a balance sheet, and a bankruptcy filing could be stamped and docketed in an afternoon, but neither document could show the empty parking lots outside the plant gates or the rows of company houses along the valley whose mortgages had been written against a wage the mill no longer paid, or the rust that began at once to bloom across the idle rail and the silent cranes the moment the fires beneath them died. The furnaces going cold was an event a camera could photograph. What went cold with them could not be entered in any book. For behind the loss and the shutdown and the bankruptcy stood a debt no filing could dissolve and no accountant could quite make disappear. Across 30 and 40 years of labor in front of those furnaces, the company had promised its workers a pension, a wage that would keep arriving after the whistle had blown for the last time, and that promise was now a number sitting in the wreckage of a bankrupt estate with no living furnace behind it to fund it. The men who had poured the steel that raised the country's towers had been guaranteed a place to stand in their old age, and the corporation that had guaranteed it was walking into a courthouse with its pockets turned out. What would become of that promise, and who in the end would be made to answer for it, was the last account the story had left to settle. The furnaces had gone cold, but the debt owed to the men who had kept them burning had not. Chapter 11. The pensions nobody would pay. The promise the company had made across a lifetime of labor came due at the one moment it could not be kept, when the furnaces that were meant to fund it stood cold above the river and the corporation that had signed it walked into a federal courthouse with its ledgers emptied out. For decades, the bargain of the mill had been a simple one, plain enough to be understood on a shop floor over the noise of a rolling line. A man gave the best years of his back and his lungs to the heat, and in return a check would keep arriving at his mailbox long after the whistle had stopped calling him to the gate. That arriving check was the pension, and by the time the estate was opened to the daylight of a bankruptcy court, the fund that stood behind it was found to be short by a staggering sum. The number that crossed the accountant's pages was a shortfall of roughly $4.3 billion. It was the gap between what the company had promised its retired workers and what the company had actually set aside in the pension fund to pay them, and it was a gap no idle plant could ever close. The mills that might have earned the money were dark. The blast furnaces that might have poured it stood in a gray and rusting row. The corporation whose name was printed at the top of every pension letter had ceased, in any working sense, to exist. And so the promise, sitting orphaned in the wreckage of the estate, was carried out of the courthouse and set down on a different doorstep entirely. It came to rest at the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, the federal agency that stands quietly behind the private pensions of American workers and steps forward only when the company that made the promise can no longer keep it. The agency took the whole of Bethlehem's collapsed plan onto its own books. It was, at the time, the largest pension liability the federal insurer had ever been made to assume in the history of the country. The retirement checks did not stop, which was the mercy of the arrangement, but they now arrived under a Washington seal rather than a Lehigh Valley letterhead, and, by the reckoning most often cited, the retirements riding on that transfer numbered close to 95,000 people. The promise had not vanished, only moved from the company's ledger to the public's. That was the quiet arithmetic of the ending, and it is worth setting down slowly, because the two halves of it almost never sit in the same sentence. The debt owed to the men who had made the steel was absorbed by the taxpayers of the nation those men had helped to build. The assets those same men had tended, the furnaces and the mills and the acreage along the water, were sold to a private buyer. In the year 2003, the steel-making assets of the fallen corporation passed to a New York investor named Wilbur Ross, whose International Steel Group had been quietly gathering the wreckage of America's bankrupt mills into a single holding. He bought the plant and the machinery. He did not buy the pension. The pension had already been left behind at the public's door before he ever signed for the furnaces. What Ross had assembled out of the ruins did not stay in his hands for long. In the year 2004, he sold the International Steel Group to Mittal Steel for $4.5 billion, and that single sale first placed his name on the Forbes 400, the published roll of the wealthiest people in the country. Lay the two records beside one another, and the ending tells itself without a word of argument. The pension the workers were owed had become a burden shouldered by the public, while the steel they had made became a fortune banked by the man who bought and flipped the estate. Both facts are true, and both were entered in the same few years, and the record simply holds them there together. So the story of the men and the story of the money parted at the courthouse and went their separate ways. The retirees left with their checks and without the company that had promised them, the financier gone with his profit. And between the two, on the south bank of the Lehigh, the thing that had started all of it stood entirely still. The furnaces were cold. The rail was going to rust in the weeds. The great gray plant that had raised skylines and armed a navy sat empty behind its fences, sold and resold on paper, while the physical acres waited, silent, for someone to decide what a dead steelworks in the middle of a Pennsylvania city could possibly be made to become next. Between the accounting and the auction, the plant itself was still waiting to be told what it was now for. Chapter 12. A Casino on the Ashes. What the silent plant was finally told to become, after all the years of waiting behind its fences, was a place built for people to gamble. The second life that arrived on the south bank of the Lehigh River did not relight a single furnace or roll a single beam of steel. It came instead as a low, bright building of slot machines and green felt tables raised across the 126-acre footprint where iron ore had once been cooked into the skeletons of a nation's cities. The ground it rose on was not empty ground. It was the brownfield of the old Bethlehem works, its soil still holding the memory of the blast. The doors opened on the 22nd of May, 2009. The gaming floor, spread out beneath a low ceiling of colored light, ranked with slot machines and card tables where the ore yards and rolling sheds had stood. Beyond the windows, floodlit against the night sky, rose the long row of preserved 20-story blast furnaces the mill had left behind. The builders had chosen not to pull the furnaces down. They kept the rusting stacks standing as a backdrop, a dark skyline of dead industry lit for the pleasure of the arriving cars, and they named the resort for that very inheritance. It was called the Sands Casino Resort Bethlehem. What had been the working heart of an empire of iron was kept on as scenery for a room built on chance. By the figures reported at the time it was raised, the cost of building that resort over the ruins was put at somewhere between $600 and $800 million. The final accounting never a number, the record settles cleanly and better carried at safe strength than stated as fact. What is not in doubt is the shape of what the money bought. It bought a gaming hall, an events tower, and a wide asphalt field of parked cars, the whole arrangement laid out in the shadow of the stacks that had once drawn the fathers of the city through the gate before dawn. Floodlights now washed those stacks for the benefit of the cars parked beneath them. There was an irony in the arrangement so complete that it needed no narrator to point it out. A structure raised to make iron had been turned into a structure raised to move money across a felt table, and the transformation had been carried out without so much as relighting a single hearth. The great charging bridges and the ore trestles that had once fed the furnaces now framed a view for gamblers and weekend tourists. The blast furnaces, engineered to run at temperatures that could melt rock, stood cold and quiet under colored spotlights, a monument photographed by visitors who had never once heard the roar the plant made when it was alive. The mill had made things the whole country used. The casino it became made nothing at all. There is a kind of memory that no gaming floor can hold, and it belongs to the people who worked the heat. If your father or your grandfather clocked in at the Bethlehem, the Lackawanna, or the Johnstown works, tell me what the whistle meant in your house, and what it was to drive past those cold stacks in the years after the gates had shut for good. The men who had made the steel were the ones most likely to know the ground the slot machines were standing on. Then the afterlife turned a second time, on the same axis as the first. The casino built on the ashes did not stay with the hands that had built it. In March of 2018, it was announced that the resort would be sold, and in May of 2019, the sale was closed. The buyer was Wind Creek Hospitality, the gaming enterprise of the Porch Band of Creek Indians, a tribal nation based in Alabama, and the price it paid for the property on the Lehigh was $1.3 billion. That figure is the quiet hinge of the whole ending. $1.3 billion changed hands for the casino laid across the ruins, a larger sum than the steelworks itself had ever commanded when its furnaces and mills and riverside acreage were broken apart and sold off in the years of the collapse. The plant that had armed a navy and raised a skyline had been dismantled for less than the gaming floor built upon its grave would later fetch in a single transaction. The record sets the two prices down beside one another and has no need to raise its voice. And so the furnaces changed owners once more, without ever changing what they were. They did not pour, they did not roll, they stood along the water as they had stood since the last heat went cold, floodlit now for a different trade, keeping watch over a ground that had been bought and sold twice over since the steel stopped. But the casino was never the whole of what rose on the old works, and the furnaces, in the end, were made to guard more than a gaming floor. Across the rest of the site, on the acres the slot machines never reached, something else was taking shape in the shadow of the stacks, something built to remember the mill rather than paper over it. Chapter 13. What Outlived the Steel. What rose on the rest of the old works, on the acres the gaming floor never reached, was something other than one more enterprise drawing profit from the ruin, a place built to remember what the ruin had once been. Across the brownfield south of the Lehigh River, in the long shadow of the preserved stacks, the city and its partners laid out a campus of the arts and gave it a name that kept the furnaces in plain sight. They called it Steel Stacks, after the 20-story towers of rusted iron that still rose over the site, and they set the new ground deliberately at the feet of the dead machines, rather than out of their view. On that campus, the public television station, PBS 39, raised its studios, its cameras and broadcast antennas standing on the same riverbank soil where ore had once been charged into the blast. Beside the studios rose the Levitt Pavilion, an open-air stage of steel and canvas, where crowds now gather on summer evenings, spreading blankets across the grass to hear free concerts played out beneath the floodlit furnaces. The music carried, night after night, across a ground that had known nothing for a century but the roar of the heats and the grind of the rolling mills. And on the plant's own former motor repair floor, inside a brick shop where the works had once rebuilt its own motors and machinery, a museum was raised to the industrial age that had made the place. The National Museum of Industrial History opened its doors on the 2nd of August, 2016, and in opening became the very first affiliate the Smithsonian Institution had ever taken on across the whole of the country. Behind its brick walls stood more than 200 artifacts of the machine century, the engines and looms and cast-iron tools of the age of steam and steel, arranged across the concrete floor where the mill's own motors had once been stripped and rebuilt. The building that had kept the works running was made, at the last, into the building that explained the works to the people who came after. So the old plant divided cleanly into two inheritances, laid side by side on the same riverbank. On one flank stood the gaming floor, bright beneath its low ceiling of colored light. On the other stood the studios, the concert lawn, and the museum, raised to hold the memory the gaming floor could not. Between them, along the black water of the Lehigh, rose the same long row of preserved stacks, looking down on the room built for chance, and the hall built for remembrance without favoring either one. And so the machinery came, at the very last, to its strangest office of all. The furnaces that had poured the wide-flange beams of the Golden Gate Towers, the furnaces whose iron had raised the skeleton of the Empire State Building and armed a two-ocean navy through a world war, now stood lit through the night above a casino floor, floodlit as scenery over a room built for the passing of hours and the forgetting of them. The stacks that had once fed the landmarks of a continent were kept burning with light alone, a dark and handsome backdrop for the cars arriving after dark. Nothing about the arrangement was hidden, and nothing about it was explained away. The furnaces were not torn down, and they were not put back to work. They were left standing, cold and enormous, lit from below, holding the same skyline over the water that they had held on the day the last heat ran. They guarded a gaming hall on one flank and a museum of their own history on the other, and they kept watch over both with the same blind, floodlit patience, indifferent now to which of the two the crowds had driven in to see. The steelworks that built modern America had been dismantled, sold, and paved over. What was left standing on the ground it had held was a casino, a concert lawn, a television station, and a museum of the age it had belonged to, all of them gathered in the shadow of the furnaces that would not come down. What outlived the steel was the furnaces, and the memory they were left to guard.